My wife and I loved going to the movies. It was our thing, a way to escape from reality and get lost in different worlds. We'd always pick the late-night shows when the theater was nearly empty. It felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. That night, though, something was different. It was our usual routine. We got our tickets, grabbed some popcorn, and found our seats near the back. There were only a handful of people scattered around, all focused on the big screen. The movie started like normal, and we settled in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My wife noticed it too. She leaned over to me and whispered,
"Doesn't this place feel a bit off tonight?"
I nodded, brushing it off at first. It was probably just because the theater was unusually quiet, even for a late-night show. The movie played on, but halfway through, the screen started flickering, and the sound cut in and out. At first, I thought it was just a technical glitch, but then I saw my wife stiffen beside me. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice shaky. She pointed to the screen, not saying a word. At first, I didn't see anything strange, but then, in the background of one of the scenes, I spotted it. Someone standing in the shadows just behind the main character. They weren't part of the movie. They didn't move. Just stood there, watching, like they were part of the theater itself. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. It had to be a mistake, some weird editing error. I turned to my wife to reassure her, but before I could say anything, the lights in the theater flickered, and for a split second I saw someone standing in the aisle, just a few rows down. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and they were gone. We exchanged nervous glances, but neither of us said anything. Maybe it was just my imagination. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed. The other people in the theater didn't seem to react at all, their eyes glued to the screen, unmoving. The movie continued, but I couldn't focus anymore. My wife's grip on my hand tightened, and I could tell she was scared too. Then out of nowhere, the screen went black. The sound of the movie stopped, leaving only silence. No one moved. It was as if the entire theater was frozen in time. Suddenly, the projector flickered back to life, but this time it wasn't showing the movie. Instead, it was footage of the theater, our theater. I could see us, sitting in our seats, along with the few other patrons, but something was horribly wrong. In the footage, shadowy figures began to emerge from the walls, slowly creeping toward us. I stared in disbelief as one of the figures moved closer to the screen version of my wife, its dark hand reaching out. I grabbed my wife's arm and whispered, "We need to leave, now." She didn't move. She was staring straight ahead, eyes wide, breathing shallow. I shook her gently, panic rising in my chest. "Come on, we have to go." That's when I saw it. On the screen, the shadowy figure had reached her, and in real life I could feel something cold and invisible brushing against her shoulder. Without thinking, I pulled her to her feet, dragging her toward the exit. As we stumbled out of our row and into the aisle, I glanced back one last time. The figures from the screen were now in the theater, standing in the rows we had just left, watching us. Their faces were blank, featureless, but I could feel their eyes on me. We ran out of the theater, bursting into the empty lobby. I didn't stop until we were outside in the cold night air, both of us gasping for breath. My wife looked at me, her face pale, still in shock. Neither of us said a word on the drive home. We never went back to that theater again. But sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring blankly into the distance, like she's still stuck in that moment, like something from the theater followed us home. I'd been working at the old cinema for a few months now. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small single-screen theater that showed older movies. The place had a certain charm to it. the kind that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. I usually worked the late-night shifts, which I didn't mind. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and it gave me time to relax after a long day. That night started like any other. It was the last screening of the night, an old black and white film from the 50s. There were only a few people in the audience, maybe 5 or 6, all scattered around the theater. I remember thinking how empty it looked, but that wasn't unusual for a weeknight. I was working in the projection room upstairs, keeping an eye on the film reel as it spun steadily. The soft hum of the projector always had a calming effect on me. It was almost like white noise, something that helped me relax. I leaned back in my chair, watching the monitor that showed a live feed of the theater below. Everything seemed normal. As I glanced at the screen, though, I noticed something strange. At first, it was just a figure standing in the back row, perfectly still. I hadn't seen anyone walk in, but sometimes people slip in after the movie starts, so I didn't think much of it. They were standing rather than sitting, which was odd, but I figured maybe they were just stretching their legs. Minutes passed, and I kept glancing at the monitor. The figure hadn't moved. They were still standing there, completely still, like they were waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine. Something about it felt wrong. The rest of the audience hadn't noticed anything. They were focused on the movie, not aware of what was happening behind them. I decided to go down and check. Maybe it was just a customer who needed help. Grabbing my flashlight, I quietly made my way down the narrow staircase, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I reached the theater entrance and peered inside. The movie was still playing, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I scanned the back row, but there was no one there. The figure was gone. Feeling uneasy, I stood there for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The audience remained oblivious, still absorbed in the film. I walked up and down the aisle, checking each row, but everything seemed normal. I started to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe the shadows had played a trick on me. I returned to the projection room, but when I looked at the monitor again, my heart stopped. The figure was back, standing in the same spot, unmoving. This time, though, it was closer to the screen, just a few rows behind the audience. My hands shook as I stared at the monitor. There was no way someone had gotten in and out that fast without me seeing them. I hesitated, trying to decide what to do next. I could go back down, but part of me didn't want to. Something felt terribly off, like I was dealing with something I didn't understand. I watched as the figure slowly moved forward, inching closer to the seats. But the audience still didn't react. It was as if they couldn't see it. I had to do something. I grabbed my flashlight again, my heart pounding, and ran down the stairs. This time I burst into the theater, shining my light across the rows. But once again, the figure was gone. I stood there, feeling foolish, wondering if I was losing my mind. Then I heard it. A soft whisper. It wasn't coming from the screen. It echoed around the room, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like a faint voice trying to speak to me, but just out of reach. I looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but there was no one there. The audience remained still, not even flinching at the sound. I backed out of the theater, feeling the panic rising in my chest. As I returned to the projection room, I half expected to see the figure on the monitor again. But this time, the screen was black. No movie, no people, nothing. Just darkness. I quickly checked the equipment, trying to get the film back up, but everything seemed normal. I flicked a few switches, and the movie resumed, as if nothing had happened. I stared at the screen, waiting for something else to go wrong. But the figure never appeared again. The movie ended without incident, and the few customers left quietly, unaware of the strange events that had unfolded. As I locked up that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The whispers, the figure, it all felt too real to be a hallucination. I never saw the figure again after that night, but every time I worked the late shift, I found myself glancing at the monitor, half expecting to see it standing there, watching from the shadows. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew that something had been in that theater with us, something that didn't belong. It had been years since the old cinema at the edge of town closed down. I'd always been curious about it. As a kid, I used to hear stories about the place, how people would enter but never leave, how strange noises could be heard late at night. But those were just urban legends, right? One evening, my curiosity got the better of me. I had nothing else to do, so I decided to check it out. The building looked just as eerie as I remembered, its paint chipped and windows boarded up. I found a way in through a side door that had been left ajar, and I stepped inside. The smell of dust and decay hit me immediately. I made my way through the lobby, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Old movie posters hung on the walls, faded and torn. I wandered deeper into the building until I reached the main theater. The seats were covered in a thick layer of dust, but it looked like they hadn't been moved in years. Suddenly, the projector came to life, casting a dim light on the screen. My heart pounded in my chest. No one was here. At least, that's what I thought. The reel started to spin, and an old black and white movie began to play. I was frozen, watching the screen, when I heard something behind me. It was the soft sound of footsteps, but when I turned, no one was there. The sound continued, growing louder. I started to feel cold, the kind of cold that cuts to your bones. I knew I had to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I looked back at the screen, and to my horror, the movie had changed. What was once an old film was now showing the theater I was standing in. I could see myself on the screen, sitting in the front row, watching. But I wasn't alone. Slowly, figures began to appear in the other seats, one by one, until the entire room was filled. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't alive. Their hollow eyes stared at the screen, at me, unblinking. I bolted out of the building, gasping for air. I never went back, and I made sure to tell no one about that night, until now. I've always loved going to the movies late at night. It's peaceful, there's hardly anyone there, and it feels like the entire cinema belongs to you. That night, I was particularly excited. There was a special midnight screening of an old horror classic that I'd been wanting to see. I got my ticket, bought some popcorn, and walked into the theater, expecting just another quiet movie night. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The lobby was empty. No one was at the ticket counter, no one at the snack bar. At first I thought maybe I had arrived too early, or that they'd closed the lobby early since it was a late show. But the doors were wide open, and the lights were dimmed, so I shrugged it off and made my way to the theater. Inside, the movie was already playing. I looked at my watch. I wasn't late, but the film had clearly started. I hurried to find a seat in the middle row and sat down, trying to focus on the screen. That's when I noticed something strange. There were a few other people in the theater, scattered across the seats, but they weren't moving. They weren't even shifting or reacting to the film. They just sat there, completely still. At first I thought maybe they were just really into the movie, but even during the intense scenes where there should have been gasps or nervous laughs, there was nothing. Just silence. I tried to focus on the film, telling myself I was being paranoid, but my eyes kept drifting back to the other people in the theater. There was something wrong about them. I couldn't see their faces clearly in the dark, but their posture was stiff, unnatural, like mannequins. My unease grew, but I kept watching the movie, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Then, about halfway through the film, the screen flickered and the sound cut out. For a moment, the theater was pitch dark and eerily silent. I leaned back in my seat, waiting for the film to resume, when I heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone walking up the aisle, but no one was there. The other people in the seats hadn't moved. They were still sitting completely still, as if frozen in time. My heart began to race. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Suddenly, the screen flickered back to life, but something was different. The picture was distorted, the colors all wrong. The sound was warped, like it was playing underwater. I glanced around, hoping someone else had noticed, but the others remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the screen. I stood up, feeling more anxious with every passing second. I had to leave. I didn't know why, but I felt a growing sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. As I made my way toward the exit, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. The people in the seats weren't people. Their faces were pale and featureless, like wax figures. Their eyes, or what should have been their eyes, were just empty, hollow sockets staring blankly ahead. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that whatever these things were, they weren't human. They never had been. I bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing through the silent theater. I pushed open the door and ran down the hallway, not daring to look back. As I reached the lobby, I realized something even stranger. The posters on the walls, the ones advertising the movie I'd just watched, were old, faded, and torn, like they'd been hanging there for decades. It was as if the entire place had been abandoned for years, but I knew that couldn't be right. I had just bought a ticket. I rushed outside, gulping in the fresh air. The streets were empty, and the night was eerily quiet. I kept running, not stopping until I was far from the cinema. When I finally got home, I tried to make sense of what had happened, but none of it added up. The next morning, I decided to do a bit of research on the cinema, hoping to find some kind of explanation. What I found sent a chill down my spine. The theater had been shut down years ago after a fire during a midnight screening. Several people had died, trapped inside the burning building. No one had been inside since. And yet, I had been there just last night. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced. All I know is that I'll never go back to that theater again, and I'll never look at midnight screenings
And there you have
the
it.
same way. 4 terrifying tales that might just make you think twice before heading to the movies. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next scare. Stay safe and keep your eyes on the screen.